the two covenants. When we talk about the two covenants, are we talking about two different ways of salvation? The Old and the New way, like the Old and the New Testament? Or, when Paul uses the word covenant twice, he seems to have a very different, unexpected, and deep meaning in the Galatians 4, verse 21 to 31. Let's find some answers in this week's lesson.
Lay down.
It is worth mentioning from the beginning that the passage from the Galatians 4, verse 21 to 31 that we're studying this week, according to the scholars, is found to be one of the most difficult in the whole letter. Does that make it less important? I don't think so. It's just another thread of the apostles' effort to distinguish between two very common but opposing ways of salvation. My way, works of the law, and through God's grace and His promise.
Right from the beginning, the author makes it very clear. Salvation was never by obedience to the law. Biblical Judaism, from the start, was always a religion of grace. The two covenants are not matters of time. Instead, they are reflective of human attitudes. They represent two different ways of trying to relate to God, ways that go back to Cain and Abel. It's interesting how easily we forget that the problem with Cain was that he came to God presenting his works. A very disastrous way to go. Trying to understand Paul's point in Galatians 4:21 to 31, the lesson leads us to a study of what a covenant is, what was the Abrahamic covenant, and what does Paul mean when he talks about Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, Ishmael, and Isaac.
And in ancient times as is today, a covenant is a form of relationship between people that made them promise and agree on different issues. The lesson even stretches our attention back to Adam and Eve, who were in agreement with God that they were not going to eat from the tree in the middle of the garden. Otherwise, there were consequences. Later on, God entered into a promise, a covenant with Abraham, that He will bless him with a son and with many generations to come.
Some can speculate that humanity was doomed for failure because of the free will. It was just a matter of time. But the lesson, based on the Bible, states that obedience was humanity's natural inclination. Yet, Adam and Eve chose to do what was not natural. And in that act, they not only ruptured the covenant of creation, they made its terms impossible for humans now corrupted by sin. Only God could restore this broken relationship. This is why He reached out to Abraham and made a covenant of grace with him. In the previous lessons, we spoke about how God was making promises and Abraham didn't promise anything back. But there is a different element for this week. The term covenant, as used by Paul here, refers to a binding contract or a treaty that was made over a slaughtering of an animal, symbolizing what will happen to the party that doesn't stick to his commitments. Now, do you remember who was making the promises in this covenant? God pledged His life.
Did God fulfill His promise to Abraham? No, He didn't. Not at least for another 10 years after He made His promise. So Abraham and his wife decided to figure out a way on their own. This is their solution. Abram enters into an intimate relationship with Hagar, his concubine, with the approval and encouragement of his wife Sarai. And voila, problem solved. A baby boy was born. However, Apostle Paul had a big issue with that, and not just him.
It sounds strange for us today, but from human perspective, the plan of Sarah and Abraham was actually great. In these times it was all legal, and Ishmael could have legally been their child. Abraham pleads God to accept Ishmael as his heir, but the God can't accept it. It's the same like it was with Cain. The same is when we put the focus on our obedience. Isaac was the heir because he wasn't the fruit of any merits, neither from Abraham nor from Sarah, but the grace of God.
Paul writes in Galatians 4:24, the women, Hagar and Sarah, represents two covenants. One covenant is from Mount Sinai that bears children who are to be slaves. This is Hagar. But the Jerusalem that is above is free, and she is our mother. Hagar and Ishmael ended up sent away in the desert by Abram. Isaac became the legitimate descendant and the fulfillment of God's promise. The apostles saw that the Christian Jews who were insisting on the Galatians to be circumcised were of the first covenant, doing the works born of the flesh, where he and the Galatians were a result of a divine promise. Children not born of the slave mother, but born from the free mother.
This part about Hagar and Mount Sinai is very powerful. Mount Sinai was supposed to be for Israel the same experience as it was for Abraham. God makes promises, and Israel wasn't expected to promise anything. God is not asking them. He promises to bless them, and in response to these blessings, to obey. Here you go, someone would say, yes, but the Hebrew term to obey, the word means actually to hear. And Israel makes the same mistake as Abraham did with Hagar. Instead of responding in humility to God's promises, they said, everything that God said, we will do. Wow. Listen more and talk less. They had no idea what they were saying. What's the harm in promising to be obedient, or wanting to be obedient, someone would ask? The lesson quotes Palmer Robertson. Instead of serving to convict them of the absolute impossibility of pleasing God by law-keeping, the law fostered in them a deeply entrenched determination to depend on personal resources in order to please God. Thus, the law did not serve the purpose of grace in leading the Judaizers to Christ. Instead, it closed them off from Christ. It closed them off from Christ. This is the sad reality. This is why Paul is taking it so seriously.
After all, we might want to ask ourselves, how do I approach salvation? Am I trying to help God when things are not going as I expected it? Am I placing my confidence and trust in laws or rituals, traditions, all of the flesh? Or my confidence is in the power of God's promise? Nothing more, nothing less.
Paul's opponents were claiming that they were the real descendants of Abraham, and that these Gentiles, unless circumcised, are illegitimate children. The truth is the opposite, according to Paul. They were the illegitimate children because they were focusing on their ways. The Gentile believers were the true heirs of Abraham's promise, as Isaac was, because they were the miracle of the grace of God. Ishmael laughed at Isaac when he was honored. Being a fulfillment of the promise of Abraham has its challenges, but let's keep the focus at the right place.
Next week we will continue our study of the book of Galatians with the lesson entitled Freedom in Christ.